Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Ohev Sholom, and thank you to coming to our Yom Iyun and exploring new halachic solutions to the Agunot crisis. My name is Ruth Belinsky-Friedman, and I work here as the Maharat, or member of the female clergy, with Rabbi Shmuel Hertzfeld. And we're so grateful that all of you came this morning, and of course to our incredible speakers for taking the time to come and to share their insights with us. So we just spent a Shabbat with Rabbi Jeremy Stern and Meira Zach, who both work for ORA, for the Organization for the Resolution of Agunot. And they've told us about the work that they are doing to help agunot, to help women who are in marriages that they cannot escape, get out of those marriages and find peace and an ability to move on. And their work is incredible. They both work tirelessly, their whole organization tirelessly, to help women and families as much as they possibly can. And to that effect, I just wanted to mention that they do have copies of a post-nuptial agreement. We heard over here, we heard about a little bit yesterday about the prenuptial agreement, which is something that couples can sign before they get married to help prevent this terrible thing from happening. And it's also possible for couples who are already married to also sign that. And so they have copies of that, and also will be able to explain a lot about how that works. So it's never too late to sign a prenup or a postnup. And what we wanted to do today was to take a slightly different approach and to think about, there's so many tragedies happening in our community with this Agunah crisis. And as we heard, there are so many people working to fix this as much as possible. And maybe we can also try to explore new halachic solutions, new solutions in the Jewish legal framework, to try to make sure that this never happens to another woman and to another family ever again. And to that end, we have Rabbi David Bigman from Israel and Rabbi Dov Linzer visiting from New York, and our own Yaakov Roth here to all talk about different ways that we can work to make sure that this never happens again. And so we're going to stick to time, so I'll be very brief. We have here these sheets. The front has the schedule and information. And on the back, we have the biographical information for all of our speakers. So feel free to look to that for more information. But just a quick word about our first speaker, if it's possible to say just a quick word. So Rabbi David Bigman, or is that case say David or David Bigman? Or what? David, sorry. What can we say? Rabbi Bigman is the Rosh Yeshiva of Ma'ale Gilboa in Israel, for those who are familiar with it. And he is so much more than that also. He is really one of a tremendous rabbinical figure and leader of the Orthodox community, and really bears no introduction. I know that Rabbi Hertzfeld also has a close personal relationship with him, and really one of the tremendous leaders of Orthodoxy today and of Halacha. And so we are so grateful to him for coming to share his words with us. What we will do for the first two sessions is we will have about 30-35 minutes, and then we will leave some time for questions. So I'll be moderating the time. So if you have a detailed clarification, please ask, and if not, we'll save the bigger questions for the end. So thank you all so much.
I hope I can project. I'm getting over a flu. I will start by telling this following story, which is that I was in Blue Greenberg's kitchen. I was eating lunch or something, and she said, "We need a comprehensive solution, immediate and comprehensive." And I said, I don't think we can provide an immediate and comprehensive solution. There was a little bit of tension in the room. At which point I tried to think about which could be provided quickly, or I should say, what was more feasible now, immediate or comprehensive? And so I started thinking about it. Everybody was mostly working on the comprehensive, and I thought I should work on the immediate. In other words, try to think of things that could be done that wouldn't solve the problem for all agunot, but might solve the problem for some. How many, we will discuss as we go on. In other words, one of the problems is how far we can go with this tool. I'm not so sure. I don't mean now, I mean halachically and in terms of what would be accepted. So we will talk about that. I was glad to hear your comments about it. But I will tell you what my thought was then and what it is now, and about one particular case where we actually did this, but the case was such an extreme case that it really doesn't test this tool very well. And I'll explain to you why that is so. So we have a passage in the Gemara that says the following. I will quote. אלא מעתה, יבמה שנפלה לפני מוקשרים, תבוק ולא חליצה, דעדייתי דהכי לא קידשה עצמה. Okay, so the Gemara says, according to this previous discussion, the Gemara is in the middle of the discussion, if the Yavama falls to her levirate husband, the brother, who is afflicted by boils, she would not need chalitza. Why would she not need chalitza? Because when she originally got married, she didn't have this kind of circumstance in mind. If she had known that she would fall to a brother who was stricken with boils, she never would have gotten married. Does you understand the significance of this? This means that it's not what we would call normally mekach tovud. Mekach tovud would mean that, let's say, you got married with somebody, male or female, got married with a spouse, and it turned out that there was false pretenses. For instance, let's say the person said, let's say the husband has a very, very difficult medical situation, and he didn't let the wife know ahead of time. And after they got married, it turned out that he has this medical situation. That would be typically mekach tovud because she didn't know something very significant when she got into this contract. This is not the case. In other words, she knew all the information at the time that the contract was made. But if she had known what would have happened, she wouldn't have gotten into the contract. This is called, by later poskim, it's called umdana de muchach. In other words, if she had known what she was getting into, she wouldn't have gotten into this. The problem is that this Gemara sort of fizzles out. I'll explain how it fizzles out. Because the Gemara then goes on to say, Hatam anatzari de meinak nechat lahu b'choldu ki Reish Lakish amar Reish Lakish tav lemeitav tandu lemeitav armala. He said, in this particular instance, with the husband's brother having boils, this would not work because we have a presumption about human behavior. It's better for her to be with someone than being alone. So this immediately leads the Rishonim, our commentators, into different discussions of what this actually means. But she had a marriage of sorts. So that would be sufficient. We would assume that would be sufficient for her to go on with the marriage. In other words, the fact that she was eventually going to might eventually fall to a levirate husband who had boils is not something that would prevent her from getting married, because women need to get married. So this statement, we'll get into it a little bit more in just a minute, but there's a big argument of the Rishonim, which marriage are we talking about? Is it talking about the original marriage, that she was married to her husband a couple of months maybe or something, or maybe she wasn't actually actualized? That's also a problem the Rishonim bring up. Or is it talking about even the marriage to the brother, the levirate marriage? It's not so clear, okay? But the important point is that once this line came in, even though we had this theoretical construct which says a woman should, if she knows this was happening, she might have not gotten in, but it means there's very few things that if she knew they were coming, she would not get into marriage, because we have this presumption that women would rather be together than being alone. Or people would rather be together than alone, but the significance from home. So the thing is, it doesn't exactly fizzle out. It doesn't exactly fizzle out because the Rishonim talk about, the Marami Rutenberg was mentioned previously, he talks about a question of what would happen if the brother was a mumar. Mumar? Yeah, not good. Not for the period, not period. What? Yes. So if he was, in the Marami Rutenberg says that theoretically we would say that she doesn't need chalitza. She never would have married her brother and fallen to this Christian brother, because nobody would want to live with a Christian brother, because she would be in terrible danger of being Christianized all the time. So that's not considered tavla meitav tandu. For a Jewish woman to live with a Christian is beyond the realm of tavla meitav tandu. But he doesn't take it up halacha l'maaseh for other reasons. So he has a way out, and it just doesn't do it that way. Okay? But that means that the Rishonim still understood that there are circumstances that are beyond this tavla meitav tandu. Okay, so this is what my thought was. I said, we can assume that a modern woman doesn't want to get married, for example, if she knows if he becomes violent. So let's say he, close to the time of their marriage, he becomes abusive. Very close to the time that they got married. It'll be very difficult if it's like 10 years later, right? But if he became abusive very soon after the marriage, we could assume quite clearly that this would not fall under the general category of tavla meitav tandu. So let's start an international Beit Din that would test cases all over the world of agunot and see how many of them fall into a category which is clearly doesn't fit the statement of tavla meitav tandu. Okay, I'll tell you what a little bit of the drawbacks in this are. First of all, I didn't know how far we could go with this. I don't know how far we can go with this. I'm talking about halachically and beyond halakha, because physical abuse is quite obvious. What about verbal abuse? What happens when it sets in a bit later? You notice that for umdad and muchach, it can be something that happens later, but we have the countering principle of tavla meitav tandu. So let's say they had a nice marriage for 5 years and something went wrong. He went crazy. So then what are we going to say? Can we then say it was a fair assumption that he wouldn't have gotten into this if she had known that something was going to be foiled, but in the meantime they had a happy marriage for a few years? Complicated. Okay, so I said, but there are places that would be quite clear. Okay? This was my thought. I suggested the Agunah summit, and to tell the truth, I thought I'd be laughed at. To tell the truth. Honestly, I thought it'd be laughed at because it can only solve a small portion of the problems. I don't know how many, because we don't have statistical evidence of how many husbands who are recalcitrant husbands were also abusive at a very early start. You know, how they started, we don't know. I don't think there's any statistics about it. It might be more significant than I think, right? But I said at least it will solve some of the cases quite quickly, okay? So, just so you know, I'm going to get back into this theoretical issues in a minute, but you should know that there is an international Beit Din being founded. It was announced in Jaffa with the support of Zalman Nechemia Goldberg. It's being worked on, and it might actually happen. But even if all this happens, it will only solve a certain number of cases, and I don't know how far we can stretch the principle of umdada de mucha. It's clear that she never would have gotten into this. Okay, so now I want to tell you, just because it's interesting, about a case I was involved in about 2 months after this. So it's a very extreme case. It's so extreme that it doesn't really test anything. Okay, the case is this. There is a young Israeli girl of a lower socioeconomic status, class, whatever, I don't know what you call it, who was made pregnant by a young fellow who was half Israeli and half African American, the family had been converted, had come on Aliyah. His mother had married an Israeli, his name was Peretz. They came on Aliyah. All of the mother and the children converted, okay? And then at age 13, approximately 13, but this is mostly hearsay, he started saying things like, well, I'm not really Jewish, I'm Christian, I don't really identify, but off and on, sort of, okay? This is important because one of the Dayanim thought that was the most significant piece, and we didn't think so. But in any case, Then he apparently went around trying to get a few girls, and eventually he got this girl. They lived in her parents' home, and she became pregnant, so they decided to get married. Okay, so their side of the family is a very poor family, so let's have a very modest wedding. But the other side said, let's have an elaborate wedding with a lot of guests. The only thing was, all the guests were from the girl's side. Because these families are like an offbeat family. They don't really have any friends in Israel. So all the guests were from her side. What does it mean when you have an elaborate wedding in Israel? It means you get a lot of presents, of checks, okay? So the thing that happened was this. The day after the marriage, she's hospitalized. He doesn't even bother visiting. Eventually, they got a hold of her. He visited her at the hospital. The following day, he disappears. Oh, excuse me. That morning after the wedding, his mother called her in-laws and said, I opened the box with the presents and the checks were all gone. They just disappeared into thin air. Okay. So here's the situation. The fellow is gone, apparently with the checks. He's gone in America. The girl's left without a get, and even nobody knows what happened to them. Okay. Eventually, there is an injunction slapped on the mother because they didn't pay the hall. So they owe 40,000 shekel to the hall. Okay. By the way, these are things I would never think of dealing with. I just teach. I'm not about this kind of thing. So anyway, I got a wind of this whole thing as I was coming back from the Agunah summit because the mother called me asking for money to bribe her son-in-law to give the get. The bribe was 40,000 shekel. 40,000 shekel was what he needed so that his mother could join him in America. He's living in America with somebody else. And in order for his mother to leave, they have to get off this court order. So that you have to have 40,000 shekel. So I write this note to my friends in Malagabo, very embarrassed. I said, this is a horrible thing. I talked to the mother, and I talked to Batya, a voice of Tumti. It was a legitimate story. Because I thought maybe it's a con game. I don't know. It was, but not what I thought it was. I thought maybe I didn't know what it was. So it sounded so crazy. So it was all legitimate. So I said, I'm very embarrassed that we have to bribe somebody to give a get. But we have to help this poor girl. So, okay. So we started collecting money. About 2 weeks later, Batya says, I have the case for Umtar the Muchach. It was the same case. I didn't recognize it. It took a while to get everything together. I want to, and we have Avram Dov Levine, who's this maverick Haredi rabbi, and we'll get to Mickey Abraham's going to go along. Mickey Abraham is also this maverick guy. He teaches the Baila. So we have three anarchists. So we have three anarchist rabbis. Let's put together a beitin and show the world that this can be done. We knew the get was on the way. That's a different meeting story in itself. Okay, so we put together a beitin. We hear them. By the way, Avram Dov, I thought we were coming to preliminary discussion. Avram Dov Levine said, well, Bigman, you're the third Dayan. That's why I became a Dayan that day. Right? So he said, I need you for the third Dayan. You will be my third. We're going to solve this problem, okay? So we get to all the details. He was convinced that the conversion was inappropriate. That it did because when somebody is converted as a child, they have the right to renege. And it would seem that he reneged. It was a little flimsy, a little hearsay. We weren't so sure about it, right? He doesn't like the rabbinist conversions in general. He doesn't like the establishment in general. That we all have in common. We don't like the establishment. So in any case, but he admitted all three of us had the same idea, that in this particular case, it was clearly a case of Umdad and Muchach because there was no marriage. They were together, they were living together before that, but they lived together after the marriage for 3 hours in the hotel. And then she was off to the hospital, she didn't feel well, that was the end of it. And then he was off to America. So she didn't get any time to do. There was no living together at all. So it seemed like a clear case of Umdad and Muchach. Okay, by the way, there is a tshuva, Rabbi Shalom Natanson, very similar case. There was a fellow in jail They had a girl bring him some food. Him and his two fellow criminals, he passed something on to her and said, "Hareh Mekudeshet." The girl unknowingly took whatever it was, and then he started blackmailing her. And if you want to get, you have to pay me off. This is something historically, this problem of Misrovot and these con games they start coming in about 200 years ago. More and more and more and more, they get worse and worse and worse and worse and worse and worse. That's the historical sequence. So Rochelle Nathanson said, she didn't know, so it was making it she didn't really know it was Kedushin. But even if she had known it was Kedushin, I would say this is a clear case of Umdala Nebucha, because there's no tough to make up to do when it's much worse than having a brother who's a Christian. But there is also tshuva of Yudah, which I was not aware of at the time, who goes through the whole thing theoretically and just doesn't do it. It's not clear at all. It's not clear at all why. The whole tshuva is for it, and the last line he said he doesn't do it. He balks. I don't know why. Nobody knows why. When I asked several Dayanim, they said it's very famous that nobody knows why he balked. At the end, he doesn't actually do it. So you have a point for us. You talk to later authorities. Okay. So in any case, after we gave the psak, she actually did get the get in a certain way. However, it's not clear whether the get is kosher. It's complicated because, first of all, the get got lost in the mail somehow. I don't know, it's like crazy. But the thing is that, let's say he was a convert, okay? Let's play this out a little bit. Let's say he was a convert. It was a legitimate conversion, but he's now Christian. What does that make him? A mumar. Okay, the way the rabbit in Israel, who is very good in a certain sense, so they're very meticulous about trying to pay the husbands off. It's kind of hard to explain. They do a good job trying to get a get, even though they have to play along with all these. This is a very extreme case because usually the Christian husband is not a con man, right? This was a sting. So it's much very extreme case, but they pay off the Christian husband pretty well. The usual process is they go send somebody with the money, and then the Christian husband sends the get with a shaliach hovala. Okay. The problem is that they use the same process here. What's the problem with that? Do you have any legal minds? A mumar can write a get, but a mumar cannot send a shaliach. Okay, so there's a little bit of a problem. Don't tell me there's a problem with the get, because we think she's not married anyway, so it's not a problem. But the reason I want to tell you about bureaucratic minds, not only about halakha. The bureaucratic mind is just to do everything by rote. The case came into the Israeli rabbinical court. These other options, whether the giur was a serious giur, they were discussed very mildly. Whether maybe it was they didn't follow it up to the end. They just went and they said, let's read machbir and get her a get, which is not the way a serious Beit Din works. It's just like, that's a bureaucratic mind. Let's not get involved in all this. Let's just get her a get. But then when they went to get the get, they just did it in the standard way. They didn't take into consideration the particular halachic situation at hand. So it's really horrible. Anyway, so that's the particular story. The question is, this solution, it's a minor solution in terms of what it can encompass. Theoretically, we may be able to include other cases beyond physical abuse. It would depend. I have a friend who thinks we need a sociological study of what the modern woman has in mind when she's getting married. What's her minimum? I don't know. I think he wanted it for physical abuse. I don't think physical abuse, we need anything. I don't think any posek in any posek of any generation who is living in modern society would think that a modern woman was willing to get married and put up with physical abuse. In her mindset when she got married. Like that, to me, that seems shita, svarab shuta. Okay? The other questions that can come up into mind is, what if she stayed with him a little bit? Because she thought he was going to get better, because he said he would go to therapy. A lot of times there's this mindset, we'll make it better. Right? Moshe Feinstein says, if she has an excuse, why she stayed, it's not savra. There's a halachic concept called savra v'kibla. If a person got into a transaction, but it was a bad transaction, but he hung along with it, it would be considered like acquiescing to it. But that, Moshe Feinstein says that's not the case if there's a serious reason why the person was staying in this contractual agreement, which would explain what his behavior was, and not that he was actually acquiescing to the particular thing. So he says in the question of Agunah, so that would be a useful tool. We could say, if the woman could say, I stayed with him for a year because he said he would go to therapy, but he didn't. So maybe we could do that as well. I don't know how far this can be stretched. We will only know when the Beit Din will be founded. I said that unlike Reckman's, Beit Din would have to have complete transparency so that people will know what's going on and why they're doing what they're doing. I think we're ready for questions. So, I don't know names, so I'll just...
My name is Risa Goldstein, and actually one of my friends from my undergraduate days is doing a Molly Boa now. Her birth name was Judy Firestone. I don't know what her married name is. Neither here nor there. You're talking about physical abuse and why women stay. And one of the very, very common things, I'm a mental illness and addiction researcher, and I've taught the epidemiology of interpersonal violence. And one of the things that you very, very commonly hear is the time that a woman is at greatest risk, she and her children are being killed, is when she leaves. And for the first year or so after she leaves. So, he'll go to therapy is one side of it, but the sheer unbridled terror of what it would mean to leave. I mean, there's also the economic dependency, there's also a lot of other things, but how would that make or break your case?
It would help very much, because then we could say that she was what we call in halacha anusa. It was forced situation. She didn't acquiesce to this at all. It was just
I can give you all kinds of scientific science.
It would be very useful. For years now, we've been talking about it at the YCT, that we need a lot of scientific study of different women to see how we can solve problems.
If I can get your email, I'll send you a
Thank you very much. Yes, please.
Well, the Rabbi, I was interested in the status of the Beit Din that you convened in this case, and also the Beit Din, which I've heard about, that is being convened in terms of the Rabbi accepting these Beit Din. What is the authority in terms of the rabbinic system in Israel in terms of these Beit Din being established?
Okay, let's start with the negative and go to the positive. Our Beit Din had no official capacity whatsoever. It was almost a publicity stunt to the sense that we said we wanted to show this could be done, right? Because she possibly could go on with our heter and get married somewhere, but it's unlikely that the Israeli rabbi would do anything. Not only that, she filed a suit to be considered a single woman and not a grusha. It's an aksika. They said, you have taken money out of the Agunah fund on false pretenses. So if you give us back the money, we'll consider your case. Of course, I even was collecting money for it. Nobody had any idea that we were going to go this way. So it's completely, they're just horrible. They were just horrible. The way they reacted in the papers, but we have no official capacity whatsoever. The international Beit Din, we might get away with it because we have Zalman Nehemiah Goldberg with us, who's an establishing person, and it's not like this kind of, not three troublemakers. I don't know how much I'll be involved. I'll be involved to the extent that it can help, and I won't be involved to the extent that not being involved can help it out. I don't know. It's a question. Wait, there was questions here first.
Yeah, maybe should we just start and then go on?
Yeah, I need you to.
Okay, great, terrific. Okay, so yes, first. Yes.
Okay. It's almost like a catch-22. If she stays, then she's considered acquiescing, although what you said is so true. But one reason people might not leave is they may be concerned that they won't be able to get it. You know?
I haven't thought about that. Good question. So everything is a catch type of situation.
Right.
Yes.
you were talking about, you don't think there's so many cases, and obviously physical abuse is very obvious. But emotional abuse is not so obvious, but it's a pattern of behavior that has happened from the time the person first met the individual, because the abuser has a history of power and control problems. And so emotional abuse is in some ways much worse because it's very hard to detect and understand. In fact, Rabbi Twersky writes of a case where a young woman goes on a date with a young man, and the first date he compliments her on her clothes, and the second date she's wearing something different, and he compliments her but says, the first outfit was much better, I think you should wear it next time. So it's devious, it's very devious. And emotional abuse is very evident in most cases of where there are agunot. There's been, I think it's documented. So I think you have many more cases than you believe you do.
No, that might be so. We'd have to check only once. If the International Beit Din got sanctioned and people accepted the jurisdiction, and one of the more obvious for the same reason. In other words, because it's physical abuse is physical and blatant, it might be less damaging than emotional abuse, much easier to prove in court. So if we start with that, maybe at some time we can move on to emotional abuse. That was the idea I had. But we first have to have the court established and then have it sanctioned, and so yes.
Yes. What would you say is the most important thing for today's young people to know about the Agunah crisis and about the process of getting a get? If you had to name one thing that would be most important for today's young people to know about that topic, what would it be and why?
I think the most important thing is the solution. Prenups, which although we'll talk about different types of prenups, I think the solution is the most important thing to put. For young people, it's the most important thing. By the way, awareness of abuse. I had a couple that I was trying to convince to sign a prenup, and the way he was reacting worried me. Now, the prenup can be a way of sifting out puzzles that are going to be a problem. But I very rarely saw. Sometimes both sides said, we're okay, we just want a traditional, that's a different story altogether. But when you see that she wants it and he's refusing, I don't know, that seems like it's already so we'll get it, there's no even a get. Yes,
Sure.
Not to get too technical, but could you clarify if the approach of Agunah and Muchach based on sort of evidence soon after the marriage or circumstances soon after the marriage becomes relevant because it counteracts the concern of problematic pandu? What's the need of the Gemara and the classic halacha to focus on to insist that mekach tov, when basically say that it was false pretenses, that the problems were present at the time of the marriage, since what you're claiming is that really the halacha could and should allow for problems that come up after the time of the marriage.
I'm sorry, that should have been the lecture, it was included originally. Actually, this is discussed at great length by the Rishonim. They have several problems. One, they say, if this is the case, we can just solve everything. And the other problem is, what about ordinary transactions, all kinds, right? A guy buys a house, okay? And by the time he gets in, there's been hurricane, what's it called? The house has been blown down, right? So, Katrina. Okay? So what they make two very important points. One point is that in order to transaction, people know there's risk. It's part of the deal. Part of the deal is knowing that there's risk. And the risk can even be the risk of it not actually coming about, right? Because this is the way business transactions take place. The other thing is that they say that all of the mumim, regarding marriage, all of the mumim are within the realm of tavlamei tavdantu. In other words, the woman might have gotten married if she had known about this particular move, but there are certain things that are beyond the pale of that. That's why it's very important to show that there's certain kinds of behavior that the modern woman would not stomach in any case beyond the usual mumim, the usual kinds of problems that come up in marriage. But it is a difficult point because all marriages have problems. That's also something young people should know. All marriages have some problems, right? But so what? We get over them. Right? So you have to make a clear line of what the serious things are that just nobody would get into this kind of marriage at all.
And then why is it a problem? Just one more clarifying point. Why is it a problem when it happens when there's first good 10 years? The paradigm you're building out of in the Gemara, when he dies and the brother becomes a mummer, whatever happens much later. So the claim could still be made. Had I known 10 years from now he would become physically abusive, I never would have agreed to it.
I think you're right. I think it's just for tactical reasons we should start with the more obvious cases. I think it could be used. That certainly could. In physical abuse, it certainly could be wide in terms of timing. I don't think that actually happens so much, by the way. I don't know. You might know more than I. Where somebody later on in life becomes abusive.
Yes. Usually when that happens, there's some clear explanation for it. But more typically, there are warning signs during the dating period, and once they are married, all hell starts breaking loose.
I did hear a story of a clear case of Mukhak, but she was just given a get immediately, where the Khatan slapped her in the Cheder Yichud. And then, fortunately, her father was apparently right on top of it. He said, "That's it, you're out, we're going to get a get." Right? But really, there shouldn't have been a need for a get. There was no Tazamei Tandu. There was no need for a get, but she got the get, and that was the end of it. Fortunately, she had a father who understood where this was going. Like most people don't get it.
Okay, we'll take one last question.
The concept that a woman would rather be married than not married, why can't that be reassessed in terms of current economic situation?
Okay, so that is a very important question. Actually, I heard, but I didn't hear the whole story because Rabbi Bigman had to leave. Rabbi Bigman told me that there was an argument between Rabbi Rackman and Ohev Sholom Yom. I don't know if this quote is exactly right, but Rabbi Rackman thought it was rebuttable and negotiable, this concept of Tazamei Tandu. And Ohev Sholom Yom thought it wasn't, apparently, because Rabbi Bigman had to go. So I didn't get the end of this. I'm going to talk to him this week. But I don't think we have to go that far. In terms of, I'm not only talking about truth, halachic truth, I'm also talking about what will work. Because even if you assume that this is not negotiable, but its parameters are negotiable. In other words, it is quite clear that one time a woman in a patriarchal society where she had no way of making living would be willing to put up with much more than she is today, right? So, but the problem is it's like a slippery kind of scale. So Moshe Feinstein was aware of this, and he said there are differences, but there are always women of different kinds, of different people, different wishes, so we don't want to touch this, okay? But he admits that theoretically we could touch this, and I think that's why we can work on the more obvious cases, right? So, which is in a way of, because if we actually could maybe even widen this more, if we just disregard the statement of Moshe Feinstein and said the modern woman is different and take it many steps further than just physical, even emotional abuse. But we haven't even got to the first base yet. So we're going to start. We're going to be conservative with a small c, do something very minimal at the beginning, things that will be likely to be accepted, and then we'll see where we can go.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. That was incredibly insightful. Thank you. Our next speaker, Rabbi Dov Linzer, is the Rosh Yeshiva and Dean of Yeshiva Chovevei Torah, which, by the way, is a co-sponsor of today's event. So we are very excited to be able to work with them in New York. And much like Rav Bigman, Rabbi Linzer is really both a giant of halacha, of mastery of Jewish law, and also of engaging with people who need their support, and always thinking of ways to help the community and support the community as much as they can. And so we are also really grateful that he is here to join us today. We have source sheets for that. So We will just pass those out quickly, and maybe I'll just help with that. Thank you. That would be wonderful. Thank you, Jeff. And so we welcome up Rabbi Windsor. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's really a great pleasure to be here. It's also a great pleasure to welcome you on behalf of Chovei Torah. Wonderful to have the opportunity to be jointly sponsoring this together with Ohev Sholom, which is a synagogue that has just done so much in terms of the areas of inclusivity and sensitivity, both within its four walls and in terms of promoting it in a larger community, and it's really just so appropriate for Ohev Sholom to be sponsoring this Yom Iyun and for us to be doing it together with them. As you heard from Rabbi Bigman, he was addressing the issue of the immediate and the case by case. I'm going to be looking at the more attempts at a more systematic solution, an approach that would be able to address all situations. The trade-off is not only in terms of the question of immediacy and getting a court behind dealing with immediate cases as opposed to a approach at a systematic solution which would require one greater backing and greater consensus behind it, but also that systematic solutions will tend to work only on new cases, particularly to the degree that they'll involve issues like stipulations at the time of the Kiddushin, Hafka'at Kiddushin, various types of solutions really will have to be implemented on new marriages. And I think that these are the two prongs that we should be working on simultaneously, and they're not at all mutually exclusive. Dealing with people that are already married and when those cases confront us, and dealing with making sure that all future marriages will be set up in a way that we won't have to deal with these problems on a case-by-case basis in the future. I want to also say one word about why this is so important. It really does go without saying. Obviously, we're dealing with tragedies on a daily basis of women that are caught in dead marriages, women that are extorted. I think by now, if the time has come in the community where we don't have to review those scenarios, although of course when you hear any one individual case, it really tears your heart out to hear about them. But I wanted to make 2 points that I think are not made enough. And one, I think, to some degree came up before. And that's the question of who is an Agunah. You'll hear people that will try to minimize the problem. Oh, there's only really 10 Agunahs in the world, by defining it in such a narrow way. In a way, you could actually say, and this will be shocking, but it's my intention, that every single married woman is an Agunah. And what do I mean by that? I mean, because I think recently they even did a study in Israel, how many women, when it comes to getting divorced, even if they get a get right away, I think a vast majority, Haredi, Datilumi, does not matter, will say that they basically just gave in to anything their husband asked for during the period of the divorce proceedings, even without threatening the withholding of a get, because they didn't want that to become a possibility. And that means that really any single woman that has been through a divorce is really an Agunah, has been abused by the power imbalance in halacha, and that has been taken advantage of, and has had her rights constrained, and has really been abused in one way or another. So really, every woman who's been through a divorce is an Agunah, and any woman who might be through a divorce is a potential Agunah. And I think that that's really quite a deeply, deeply disturbing issue, but there's a great deal of truth to that. And that gets to the other point about who else are we defending here, because we're not just defending, of course, we are primarily, and all of our focus should be on women that are being abused by this and have the potential of being abused. But you know what else we're defending is we're defending the Torah. I want to share with you just a brief passage from today's Daf Yomi. Today's Daf Yomi was talking about the issue of, it's the end of Maseches Yoma, after all the ritual of Yom Kippur and how that achieves atonement, and then we go into Tshuva, and how Tshuva achieves atonement. And the one thing which Tshuva does not atone for is the Gemara first says it's taking God's name in vain, an oath taken in vain. Then it says Chilul Hashem. Chilul Hashem is like the hardest thing to achieve atonement for. And what's Chilul Hashem? So the Gemara says here, I'll read now, I have everything on my little iPhone here. So I will tell you what the Gemara says here. Here's what the Gemara says. What's Chilul Hashem? It says, he says, Ezu Chilul Hashem. It says, anybody who acts in a way that his colleagues are embarrassed by his behavior or by even how people talk about him. And then it goes on and speaks about its way a certain person will ask. It says, it says like this. It says, somebody who studies Torah, does not act in an upright way and does not speak nicely with other people. What do people say about him? And now I lost my page. Hold on. That's the one problem with these things. Okay. Anyway, it says, Oilo Lavo, that's I really need a Gemara. Here, 1 minute. It says, what do they say about him? Here we go. Oilo Rabo Shalimdo Torah, Ploni Shalime Torah, Ra'u Kama Mekukalim Masav, the Kama Mechurarim Darcho, Valava Kasavomer, etc. It says, woe to the person who taught him Torah, woe to the person who represents Torah. And the question we have to ask is not just about the Talmidei Chachamim who act in a way that cause a Chilul Hashem, but what are we doing to the Torah itself that we represent if this type of a Torah, this type of a halacha is an embarrassment. It's an embarrassment in the larger community that we are representing a Torah and halacha that could allow for such a profound abuse, could allow for such cruelty being done within the name of halacha. And I think that, the pasuk says by the Torah, and it says, "Ra'u kol amei artz ki shem Hashem nikra lecha, rakam chacham v'gadol, rakam chacham v'navon hagoy hagadol hazeh, ki mi goy gadol hashadol chukim u'mishpatim tzadikim." What is this great nation that has such tremendous, wise, profound, just laws? And ask ourselves now, right? What does, and now the Agunah reality is known not just within the Torah observant circle; it's well known outside as well. What type of a Torah is this that we can be representing, that it's a Torah that quite the opposite of saying what a great Torah is, was a Torah that seems to be so unjust and creates so much suffering. So I think that the call to finding a systematic solution is not just one for, obviously, primarily it is one about the actual individuals that are suffering so greatly, but in addition to that, we have to be motivated also just in the sense of defending the Torah and defending halacha, and finding a way in which that we can actualize its reality as it was meant to be, which is really a just and a moral system which brings greater justice and greater kindness to the world. So how do we go about this? How do we think about what a systematic solution can be? One of the things that many people might say is, why do we need to be looking for a systematic solution? We already have the prenup. I will admit that I, for a long time, was part of that camp as well. We have the prenuptial agreement, which, when couples sign it, according to Based in America, leads, I've been told, has always led to the getting of a get if a couple has signed a prenuptial agreement. And while there is still a major problem that the RCA, which has, was the one that initiated the prenuptial agreement, does not require it from its members. And I believe that recent studies, internal studies, have shown that less than half of its members use the actual prenup, or maybe it's less than half of the weddings done by its members. I don't remember, but still, that is a major problem, because here the rabbinic organization that was the initiator could insist that its members do it and does not. I will say, by the way, that Chovevei Torah and insists that requires all of its musmachim to use a prenup, and the IRF, International Rabbinic Fellowship, which I'm a member of, also requires that all of its members use a prenup. So the first thing we need to do is to ensure that we have the strength of leadership to mandate that tool that is at our disposal right now is one that is absolutely required in terms of its use. But if it is being used, what's the problem with it? Well, one of the problems is that it still requires first of all, a protracted process. Sometimes it could take a few years to get a get. Now, as long as you do get a get at the end, it's better than no get. But number one, it could take very often 2 years. It also is not unheard of that even in there, because of the nature of the process and because ultimately it's using leverage against the husband, that sometimes it's not that it completely avoids the problems of certain types of extortions or certain types of other things that the husband might want and try to demand from the wife before he goes along, because it can still be dragged on for a very long period of time. And it also is problematic because it just, on its basic level, is not systematic, is not a way in which basically it still enshrines or reinforces the power imbalance. And that, say that's the nature of the halacha, fine, but if we have to work with that, we will. But fundamentally, still, the husband is the one in control. It provides the court with a leverage and a pressure point in order to get the husband to give the get. But a type of a system that would fundamentally shift that power imbalance and create a greater power balance obviously would be something that would be much more desired. It is unfortunate that Rivka Hout is not here because she is a decades-long Agunah activist, and she could tell you much better than I, having been in the trenches and worked with women in the process of getting a get, all of the reasons why the prenuptial agreement is still is less than perfect, and all the types of challenges and obstacles that are still in the way there. But I don't want to devalue the importance of that as our most immediate solution, and that is something that should be demanded by absolutely every single wedding. Every rabbi should require it, every chassan should demand it, and if every chassan is demanding, every college should absolutely demand it. And there really would be, there have been talks about trying to create policies about not attending weddings, not a rabbi not being a Masada Kiddushin, but lay people not attending weddings in which a prenup is not taking place, what we can do as a community to make it the absolute standard. But that's as an immediate solution. Let's talk about something that would be even more systematic. What I have for you in terms of the sheets is, I was not able, there's a lot of sources here in Hebrew, I was not able to translate them, but what I did do was I have a summary of all the sources on the front sheet. So hopefully, maybe we'll just read very briefly from one or two, but hopefully you can use this to as a nice summary of everything, and if you have a chance to look at some of those sources in more detail afterwards. So I want to talk first, number one, with the issue that is not a system, part of what I would offer as a systematic solution, but is something that I think is give us a little bit of an insight into some of the issues I just mentioned in terms of the community and the dynamics and the way these things play out. And that's going back to the discussion about, can a wife sue for divorce? Not can a wife be the one to deliver a get, as we all know, Halacha says that the man is the one that delivers a get. But can the wife basically come to the court and say, I'm suing for divorce, and I want you, the court, to compel my husband to give me a get. So the husband will still be the one doing it, but because the wife is demanding it, the court will follow the husband and actually compel the giving of a get. You might be aware that some of the ketuvot that they found in the Cairo Geniza have in them explicitly the stipulation that the wife can, if the wife at any point does not want to continue the marriage, she can sue and demand a get, and the court will force the husband to give a get. So according to the Gemara is not exactly clear about this. The Gemara talks about a woman who is a moredet, literally a rebel, and who refuses to have sex with her husband. And what is to be done in such a case? And the Gemara's point is not so clear. It basically says a husband can give a get, but he wouldn't have to pay her ksuva because she's bringing it upon herself. She's not the one having sex with her husband. The Gemara really addresses more the question about the consequence of paying the ksuva, does not address itself to the question about the court forcing the husband to give a get. And normally the cases that we are familiar with mostly about the court forcing the husband is one in which the husband, there's like a very clear case of intolerable circumstances that are being created in the home, even less than actual physical abuse, but completely objective, intolerable circumstances when the court would force it. But here the Gemara is pretty ambiguous about it. And many Rishonim say that if a woman just doesn't want to stay married, that's not enough of a reason. There's no objective thing that's making it intolerable for us to force a get. Nevertheless, the Gaonim and the Rambam rule that even if the woman just says, I don't want to stay married, that the court will force a get. And the Rambam has a famous line about this. If you take a look on page number 2, source number 1, I'll just read you the language of the Rambam. The Rambam says the following. He says, a woman who basically withholds sex from her husband, she's considered a rebellious wife. You ask, why are you doing this? She says, I find him disgusting, and I just can't go on living with him. I can't go on having sex with him. I hate him. I no longer love him. I don't find him, it's not tolerable. She doesn't have to give any other reason. Says the Rambam, you immediately compel him to divorce. Very powerful language of the Rambam. She is not like a woman taken captive, that she should be forced to have sex with a man that she no longer loves. Okay, she doesn't get her ksuva because she's sort of the one initiating it. Okay, so and he goes on to say the consequences of not getting the ksuva. But basically, according to the Rambam, the woman needs to say nothing more than, I can no longer live with him. And that then we would force to give a get because this is an intolerable situation. A number of the Rishonim strongly disagree, the Ashkenazi Rishon in particular, and they say, well, why should we allow that? He wants to stay married. She doesn't want, just because maybe she found another guy that she's more interested in, just because she doesn't love him anymore, that's what she says. Why is that a good enough reason to force him to divorce? What about Sholom Bayis, sort of like from his perspective, he wants to stay married. And the reason is that this is a lot, I think, about what we hear nowadays, right? The woman basically, wants a divorce and some type of post-game under the guise of, or under the idea that Sholom Bayis means always keeping a marriage together, particularly regardless of how the woman is feeling, that's not a good enough reason. Sholom Bayis, we should try to keep the marriage even if she wants out. I just have to say, the best line about Sholom Bayis in a slightly different context, Rabbi Riskin once said, he said, you know what the husband's idea of Sholom Bayis is? Husband's idea of Sholom Bayis is, oops, look at the time, gotta go to shul. Shalom Bayis. Gotta go to the daf yom. Shalom Bayis. So very often it's Shalom Bayit from the husband's perspective and not exactly from the wife's perspective. Nevertheless, this would be amazing if basically a woman could always sue for divorce, assuming at least you were in a situation in Israel or whatever where the courts were willing to use, some sense of force, physical force, other force. A woman could always just sue for divorce. But as you've heard, some Rishonim say, no, that's not a good enough reason. That's not justified. Just because she wants out is not a good enough reason. What is behind possibly this more, if you would, progressive or, approach of Rambam and the Gaonim? So if you take a look at source number 3 for a minute. It gives a little bit of an insight. And source number 3 says the following. It says, Miha, this is from one of the Gaonim. Rabbanan Samurai de Basar Hora'a Tiknu L'Maaseh. The Savaraic rabbis, right after the sealing of the Gemara, very early in the period after the sealing of the Gemara, established the Mishkal Afilamai Tfisa Umaisa Lagita Altar. So that's part of that is about ksuba, but basically you give her a get immediately if she demands it. Today she rotates Senab and Not Yisrael with Tarbut Ra'ah. so that the Jewish woman should not go to evil practices, on a bad path. The kash amad davar, and that is the common practice, which means that if a woman wasn't getting a get, she basically would just walk away from the marriage. Or what we actually know is that they would convert to Islam, and therefore, as Muslims, they would be freed from their Jewish marriage. And therefore, it was the pressure of, how drastic the alternative would be, which pushed the Gaonim to make a systematic takana to ensure that alternative would not happen. And that really, I think, is an important thing in terms of thinking about sort of the role of the community. We will see, for example, that one person, some even, some Rabbanim of the previous generation, you hear it nowadays as well, suggest things like we just shouldn't do kiddushin. Just, live together, secular marriage, don't do kiddushin. And I think the more that people are prepared to, I'm not suggesting, suggesting that, I'm certainly not suggesting walking away from the marriage and converting to Islam, but the more that the poskim are seeing that people won't tolerate the situation, and they're willing to actually really do some radical alternatives, the greater pressure it creates on trying to find not just a case-by-case solution, but a systematic solution. And it seems that pressure was more in Islamic lands, where I imagine that it was easier, in general, it was a more open society. It was easier to leave the Jewish community, whether to convert or just to basically just act without the constraints of the society. And therefore, the Gaonim and Rambam had this approach that basically you would compel a get when the woman would demand it. That does not become the accepted halacha, and you need even for a more objective reason, a more really intolerable situation as sort of assessed objectively, as it were, in order to compel a get. Now again, not like nowadays compelling a get is a systematic solution, certainly not outside of Israel and even in Israel, knowing sort of the deep problems within the bureaucracy and within the Israeli courts. But I share it because it was an early systematic solution, which actually came because of a sense of how radical the alternative would be if we don't come up with a solution. I mean, it looks like you're eager to say something. No? Okay.
No,
yes.
For years I thought that because the rebel wasn't acceptable, it wasn't acceptable what's called a matla muvueret. She has some reason, it's sort of in between the Agunah sort of going between kind of statement, which is a matla muvueret. If it's really courts, the rabbinical courts, would work on that, we could solve within Israel most of the problems. Right. For years and years I thought that was the way we would go. I just gave up on it.
Right. Well, that's the problem. The problem is in Israel now the courts are such that even when their cases are clearly calling that nobody would debate should call for a compelled get, the courts absolutely refuse to compel a get. They're always concerned, first of all, they generally don't want to do these things, and number two is they're concerned, maybe somebody will say it wasn't justified, and then it's a get kafui, and it's invalid. So I'm not at all suggesting that within the Israel, in America you can't do it because we don't have power. In Israel you don't do it because the nature of the courts and the bureaucracy and all of that is that they're completely, not prepared to use it even when it's clearly called for. I only put it out there not as a model of an early systematic solution that was done because there was a clear sense about if we don't do it, it's going to be even worse, and how that pushed to finding a solution. So let's talk about what other types of solutions were suggested. And this already goes back to 19th century when, more and more, when people are living as, in an open society and citizens of the state, and is not just within an Orthodox community, not necessarily even within just a Jewish community. They have identities as secular, as citizens. It's quite becomes more and more commonplace that husband leaves their wives, don't give them a get. That the local power of the local communities and of the court system is no longer in place to compel a get. And what are you going to do? And solutions start being suggested already in the 19th century, a lot of different approaches, and we're really going to quickly review them. And basically, they boil down to three. If you just look here at the cover page, you have conditional marriage, Hafka'at Kiddushin, which is annulment, and number three is assigning a get. Okay, basically, at the time of the marriage, assign a get to be given when circumstances are met. So let's just talk first about conditional marriage. So conditional marriage is very simple. At the moment of the kiddushin, they're under the chuppah. The groom says, "I'm giving you this ring on the condition that if if at some time, if we get, let's say, divorced in secular law, and by that time I haven't given you a get, you could change the specifics, but this is broad strokes. Then, and then if by that time I haven't given you a get, by the time we get divorced in civil law, by the time we're separated, whatever the case is, then this marriage will be considered to never have taken effect. I'm only marrying them with the condition that I will give you a get if by the time by the time we get a divorce. Okay, so would that work? Make a condition, make a stipulation. The stipulation, when the conditions are met, then it undermines retroactively the actual effect of the marriage. So what's the problem with that? So the first problem is that the Gemara deals with, while there's a lot of cases in the Gemara about Kiddushin al T'nai, Kiddushin is the act of the giving of the ring. That's when they're legally married before they've begun to live together. The next stage is called Nisuin. Nisuin is actually what we have sort of them being under the chuppah, saying the Sheva Brachos, or going to the Yichud room. Nisuin is the period of when they actually begin living together as husband and wife. And the Gemara deals with the case about Kidsha B'Tanai, the Kinsa Stam. The Kiddushin was done on a stipulation, but then when they actually began living together, there was no repeating of the condition. They just started living together. And the assumption is that it's a good chance that we have to be concerned that the woman waived the condition, because once they actually started living together and having sex, then she wouldn't want it that 10 years later the condition would be satisfied retroactively, they never would have been married, and therefore they would have been living in sin all those years. It would be biatzunut, it would be like they'd be, sex outside of marriage. So without repeating the condition, then it would actually be like she had waived the condition, and therefore the condition would no longer be effective. So that should be problem number one. Now, problem number two that the poskim raise is, if anybody's learned these sections in Kiddushin, there are these major sugyot called T'nai b'nei Gad u'b'nei Reuven, that you have all mishpatei ha'tanoim, you have all these details about how you have to stipulate a condition to make it binding. So the two questions that get raised is, do people really know how to do all those things correctly? Which is like, okay, fine, so hire a lawyer, or get somebody who does know, it's just to write it all out. But any rabbi, so many people who are Mesadrei Kiddushin, they don't know how to do all the details, and you have the problem that she maybe waives it when they actually start living together. So the rabbis of France tried to come up with this as a systematic solution, Kiddushay T'nai. This was shot down by, this was in the 19th century, by many other rabbis. Rav David Tzvi Hoffman at the head of them. There was a book that came out which is called Ein Kiddushin al T'nai. And some of these reasons were the technical ones. If you take a look at here again, we're only reading a very few small selections of the sources. Take a look here at source number 8. Okay. And we have the following. This is from Rav David Tzvi Hoffman, Melamed Lahoyo. He says, I'll skip to the second paragraph. He says, there are so many details that you have to attend to. If you really wanted to do that, you need a big rabbi to oversee all the details. Nowadays, he says, any young rabbi can go ahead and be a Mesader Kiddushin. So no, they don't know all these details. They're not going to do all of the requirements. Okay? So problem 101 is, yes, are there technical ways you can address the concerns? Yeah, but I don't trust you to be able to do it properly. Okay? And then he goes on and he says, and here it's very it's an insight into a policy consideration. We opened with policy considerations. It's important to note that there are opposite policy considerations. And here's what he says the following. He says, Yeter Mikain, it's about, the fifth paragraph. Okay, he says like this. Yeter Mikain, if you have a Kiddushin and T'nai on a condition, then the sanctity of marriage would completely be undermined. Nobody would feel I'm bound by my marriage, because what I'll do is eventually we'll go ahead and if I get a get, then, or don't get a get, right? We get divorced without a get, retroactively, never been married. So I won't feel that I'm bound right now by the halachic demands of what it means to be married, because retroactively I could always make it that I was never married. Okay, and he says, therefore, we can't allow such a thing. It would undermine the sanctity of marriage. And then the third paragraph, then going down one more paragraph after that, and I have another point I want to make. He says, there are now these reform rabbis, they're playing around with halacha. They say you don't have to do chalitza, okay, and it goes on, and now skipping a sentence. And with David Tzvi Hoffman, there becomes this big issue called chikui hamini, mimicking the heretics, which means doing anything that is something similar is being done by reform rabbis, or we would say conservative. That would be the concern that you hear nowadays among various issues. If it looks like something being done in another denomination, then it's going to make it look like we're just like them. Okay, even if we can do it in a permissible way. What will these reform rabbis say? In Elu ha-orthodoxim, you see, they agree to us. They agree you have to reform the system. They agree that the Torah and halacha is not just, and therefore we're right, and therefore we should be complete systematic reform. So here becomes two very interesting policy concerns in addition to the question of the specifics, right? A policy concern that is going to undermine the sanctity of marriage. And number two is, which would be the sort of the response. I started by saying if we don't do something, then we are seen as professing and upholding a system that is profoundly unjust. And he says if you do something, you're admitting that it's an unjust system, and therefore that's going to be the worst thing ever, and you're making it sound like you can do whatever you want. So personally, I think I've made it clear where my sympathies lie. I think it's much worse. I think it's sort of the injustice is known, and it's much worse to pretend that it's not a problem, and our real responsibility is to address it. And just because, again, other denominations have come up with recognized problems, and their solutions might not have been ones that work with halacha. God forbid that should seal from us the opportunity, the mandate to address these things within a halachic way. The question about uprooting the kedusha of marriage, that everything is stipulated, I'm going to push off till the end when we talk about combining them and how we think about that. I will, though, say, Rabbi Bigman knows, because we were trying a few months ago until we were all hit with the snowstorm in Israel, which I think was a whole 6 inches, but for Israel it was like the 2 inches in Chicago, completely devastated the entire, immobilized the entire country. We weren't able to have it. We were planning on having a conference of rabbis there to discuss these issues, and one very major proponent of solutions for the Agunah issue did not want to talk about any solution that retroactively would undermine marriage for this reason. I guess I want to talk about solutions, but nothing that would basically say that the entire Kiddushin is not necessarily going to be effective if under certain conditions. So this was one approach, stipulated. Is it possible to address the issues? Yes, it's possible to say that you repeat the condition at the time of Nisuin. It's possible to attend to the details. There are concerns whether you actually will attend to those specifics and details, but there also are policy concerns about retroactively undermining the marriage. I do want to I'm trying to be conscious of time. Okay, so I want to take a quick look at one or two of the responses. This is a wonderful book called Siddur Kiddushin V'Nisuin by Freiman, which is in Hebrew. I don't think, unfortunately, it's been translated into English. And this is not specifically on the issue of finding solutions to the Agunah problem. It really is covers from the time, I think, of the Gemara itself, certainly post-Gemara, I'm pretty sure it starts in the time of the Gemara itself, all of the minhagim and takanot that were established relating to Kiddushin and Nisuin goes historically, from the Gemara time to modern day, through all different types of communities, Ashkenaz, Sfarad, all different types, all in all different lands. And when you get to the modern day, he deals with all the various solutions that were put forth, the systematic solutions that were put forth to deal with the Agunah issue. So it really needs to be translated because it is like a key source book on all of these solutions. So within this book, he talks about different types of solutions. One was to do this kiddushin al t'nai, plus, as we're going to speak about, the hafka'at kiddushin, the sort of annulment of marriage. And so it's already important to note that early on they were talking about combining solutions. The more you can combine, you can address different concerns, because we got a lot of options going on here. Okay, and then, but if you want to look here at the second paragraph, number Zion, I've underlined it. He said, the chiddush in this approach, one of these solutions, which was about a kiddushin on t'nai, not just combining two solutions, kiddushin al t'nai v'takanat hafka'ah, conditional kiddushin and annulment. Says you don't have to restate. Imagine what you're doing. You're telling them under the chuppah, on the following condition. Like imagine saying that under the chuppah. So there's ways now that it's, you sort of write it out beforehand. You don't have to necessarily say it at that moment. But how about you have to restate it at the time of yichud? Because the whole problem about implicitly waiving it once you move on to the nisuin. So this, he says, this one of the solutions said you don't have to repeat it. Why? Amram ki t'nai zeh l'tovat ha'isha ino yachol lavo lidei piyusa v'gam yachbiu et hachatan v'kala that shelo yivadu atmayim b'olam. If it's done for the woman's protection, she has to be the one to waive the condition. And basically, already about 2 centuries ago, some poskim were saying, we cannot, this thing, which is obviously coming to really, in a very profound way, protect her interest and protect her from being an agunah, the possibility that, maybe the condition will be met and retroactively we'll have been living in sin and having sex outside of marriage, that's not a concern anymore. There's no question that she is not going to waive this condition, which is all there to protect her interests. So already sort of recognizing that the current realities are different, and maybe we don't even have to worry about the possibility that she might be considered to have waived the condition. Similarly, he says, there's other things about making him take an oath to promise that he's not going to waive the condition. And I want to skip to Yud Bet here and says the following. And this Rabbi Bigman really echoes what Rabbi Bigman is saying. And here's what he says the following. He says, here was the condition, underlining here in Yud Bet. If there's ever a situation of igun, you are kiddushin b'telim, lo tiyeh tzricha get, afilim chay imak derech kol ha'etz, even if they've been living together. Devadai zot umdina demuchach. Does that sound familiar from the previous lecture? The adaiti dahachi lo kitcha atzma. She never would have wanted to marry herself if it would have ended in a effective dead marriage divorce without a get. Ve'afilu below hatna'a b'feirush b'shat ha'kiddushin. Even with no stipulation. She doesn't have to say anything. So Rabbi Bigman was saying, well, if he's abusive and right afterwards, this Rav is saying that forget abusive. If he's just divorced, if they're separated, divorced, effectively divorced with no get, she never would have wanted to be married under those situations. She doesn't even have to say the t'nai. It's like there's always an implicit t'nai there. Okay, that's pretty amazing. Every single case. What I want to point out that people might be aware of, that both this and what Rabbi Bigman's approach are, they also relate to a similar approach which has fallen into disrepute. And I'm not saying there aren't halachic problems with it, but we should point out is the approach of Rabbi Rachman, that basically wanted to say that no woman would, every marriage that winds up with an agunah is effectively a nekach ta'ut. Okay, and this is no woman would ever have wanted to be in that circumstance. And this is basically saying it and the framing it as a condition. She would have always wanted that to have been an implicit stipulation, and she never would have wanted that consequence. The final point in Yud Gimel says, and this is also fascinating, talking about acknowledging modern realities, that it's no longer considered like, they've been living in sin. I would have waived the condition because I wouldn't want to be living in sin. You're not living in sin. As long as you're civilly married, says, suppose sake, in Yossi Gemara, what we decide, he says, then that's not a reality of living in sin. It's not necessarily halachic kiddushin, but it's not just stam sleeping around, and therefore we don't have to be afraid that that's going to make you waive the condition. You've been married, all right, halachically, retroactively, who knows? But it's not going to make you want to waive the condition. So there's a lot of solutions that have been put out there to say, she's not going to waive the condition. Maybe she doesn't even have to make the condition, which is really radical. Everything is umdin under muchach. There are ways to take care of it, but there's opposition. A lot of the opposition is about policy, less than about the actual specifics. That is the issue about conditional marriage. The next issue becomes, and I really think that I have to start
5 minutes
summing up. So, okay, I only got one of the three possibilities. So no more sources, all right? But I'll summarize the other two. Hafka'at Kiddushin is one that you might have heard about. Rabbi Riskin recently has really made a push, particularly in the Israeli Knesset, to try to get an idea of Hafka'at Kiddushin established. That's the idea that the rabbis could annul a marriage. Now, someone understands that the whole mechanics of Hafka'at Kiddushin is a type of a conditional marriage. Everybody makes their marriage conditional on what the rabbis will say. But there's other ways of understanding it as well. The rabbis are empowered to make the ring that was used for Kiddushin ownerless. They're empowered to acknowledge and not acknowledge marriage. It's not necessarily because it's conditional. It is worth noting two things. That there was a big question, can you do annulment of marriages after the time of the Gemara? A number of Geonim communities, again, particularly in Sfarad, did takanot that were backed with Hafka'at Kiddushin. For example, there was a takana that you had to have the Kiddushin in front of a minyan. Why? Because if there would not be 10 people around, first of all, you might get married for some crazy reason like love and not because your parents had arranged it. So they wanted to prevent people from doing that. And number two is that people would sometimes say, oh yeah, I married this woman in front of these witnesses, and now if you want me to give a get, you're going to have to give me $1 million. So in order to prevent those types of things, I said no marriage should take place if not without 10 people present, including the parents of the chassan and the kal and so on. Okay, so somebody comes and says, fine, we violated that takana. We got married anyway. So then they said, no, if you violate this takana, the marriage won't take effect because the rabbis annul the marriage if it violates this takana. And many of the Shonim felt that could work. Some had reservations, can we annul marriages after the Gemara? But many felt that they could. Now, the point is that is not directly relevant to our case. Because that is, without getting into the nuances in the Gemara, there are two types of annulling of marriages. One is a refusal to recognize the marriage from the outset. The other is, for 20 years they've been happily married and we have recognized it. Now retroactively we're going to say it's like they were never married. So what we do find is the Geonim and Rishonim being prepared to say, if you do a marriage which violates our rules, we won't recognize it from the outset. What is much rarer is saying that it was all okay, but because of X, Y, and Z later, retroactively we're going to annul it. Although that is much rarer, you do find it every now and then. There's a famous story of the Ramah with women from Austria, Neshe Österreich, that were taken by non-Jews, and there was a question whether they were raped, and the rabbis allowed them to go back to their husbands, the Kohanim, and saying that that the way to solve this would be, well, even if that happened and so on, we'll just do Hafkas Kiddushin, so it's like they were never married. And now they get married again, and we could solve the whole problem. So there was a case where it was Hafka'at Kiddushin of a marriage that had already been good, and it was after the fact. Nevertheless, that was not to allow her to marry another man, it was to allow her to stay married to her husband. So, it's not so much that we have cases of Hafka'at Kiddushin of a court actually annulling marriages that had existed to allow a woman to marry somebody else. But you do have it discussed. Even Rav Yaakov Yechiel Weinberg, the Swedish Aish, talks about the possibility of using it time to time. Although I do not believe, and Rabbi Bigman will correct me, that Rav Avad Yosef ever sort of writes about it directly in a tshuva. I do have it on very good report that Rav Avad Yosef would, from time to time, use this as well, as an after-the-fact, case-by-case, the possibility of Hafka'at Kiddushin. Do you know about this?
Only by rumor.
Only by rumor, right, only by rumor. So nothing that actually is getting written down. So that's another possibility about Hafkat Kiddushin. One thing that's worth mentioning about Hafkat Kiddushin is that when it is done after the fact and retroactive, according to a number of Rishonim, and here becomes the power of combining the different approaches, according to a number of Rishonim, because of this concern that it undermines the institution of marriage, like what is this? We were married and now retroactively you say we're not, that in order for us to be able to do it, you need there to be some semblance of a get. And then basically, I call this like the fig leaf approach. As long as there's some semblance of a get, okay, it's not a blatant use, a bald use of power. Like, oh, it was good, and now we're saying rabbis are gonna uproot it. Because the get, even if it's technically not a kosher get for whatever reason, but the presence of a get allows this to work behind the scenes and makes it look that it doesn't challenge so much the institution of marriage. And now you're beginning to see the benefit of bringing these ideas together, because not only does it, if you don't like A, you can do B, and if you don't like B, you can do C, but in some ways they reinforce one another. And this gets to the third idea, which is the idea of pre-assigning a get. So this Rav that I mentioned before, who did not like Hafkat Kiddushin, did not like Kiddushin Atznai, he said we got to totally focus on assigning the get. And assigning the get is basically before the marriage, or, you basically, the chassan goes to and says, I hereby, appoint whoever reads the following writing that he'll be my shaliach, my agent, to write a get to my wife on the condition that, we get divorced in civil court or whatever, and I don't actually, and after X amount of time, or, or by that time, I have not given her a get. The similar types of problems with pre-assigning a get are that he could always annul the pre-assignment any time prior to its actual delivery. And again, are there ways of dealing with it? Have him take an oath that he won't do it. What if he violates the oath? So actually have him basically say, I am from this moment on nullifying any nullification that I will do. I'm pre-negating any negating that I will do, or if there's ever anybody ever hears me negate it, I trust, my wife should be believed to testify more than any statement I make that I haven't negated it. So you basically make it so that any act of negation is not recognized within court. So you have all of these approaches. There are technical reasons, but a lot of those technical reasons are ways of being addressed. And a lot of the opposition has more to do with the policy question of what does it mean to have a way in which, and this was another passage from David Tzvi Hoffman I didn't read, that effectively, because you're getting divorced in secular court, that makes you divorce Jewishly. So it undermines the Kedusha of marriage, and it basically puts the power in the secular courts. By combining the three, you actually solve a lot of those policy issues as well. Because if you actually have a get, the get becomes the fig leaf, as I was saying, for the Hafkat Kiddushin. So if you don't think the get works, well, you have the Hafkat Kiddushin, but the get makes it so that it's not obviously undermining the Kiddushin. If you think a marriage on a condition is problematic because it undermines the sanctity of marriage, well, but you have the get. So, we can focus on the get, and we don't have to focus on the conditional marriage. They allow you to sort of say, look, we're going to focus on the get so it doesn't threaten the institution of marriage. And anybody who thinks that the get isn't working, we have other things that are taking care of it as well. But the presence of the get actually is a way that addresses some of these policy issues as well. And for me, clearly, the overriding policy concern is the much more profound way in which, so many people are suffering, are abused, and are being abused in the name of halacha, and halacha is becoming the tool through which is the cause of injustice and suffering, whereas halacha really needs to be the thing that brings justice and comfort to the world. So I'll end with that here.
In order so that we can remain committed to our schedule for today, I think what we'll do is now we'll have Yaakov give his presentation, and then at the end we can have some time for questions, and then if the speakers are able, they can also stay for a few more minutes and then take questions more informally. So thank you so much. That was incredible. Thank you very, very much. We now, so let's turn that off. We ask that anyone who's recording, please stop.